March 1945. A railway siding in the German town of Falkenhagen, 40 miles east of Berlin. A Soviet reconnaissance unit has just broken through a weakened Wehrmacht perimeter and is moving carefully through a complex of concrete bunkers half buried in pine forest. Their orders are standard. Secure the facility. Identify what it was used for. Report back. The unit commander, a captain named Alexei Zurevlev, enters the first bunker with 2 men. What he finds inside stops him at the entrance. The bunker is cold, temperature controlled. Along its walls, floor to ceiling, are steel cylinders. Hundreds of them, each one stamped with a yellow ring near the valve head. A color coding system no soldier in Zurevlev's unit has been trained to recognize. He does not touch them. He has never seen anything like them in 3 years of fighting from Stalingrad to the Oder River. He tells his runner to go back to the command post and get a chemical officer. The chemical officer arrives 40 minutes later, reads the markings on the cylinders, and goes very still. He turns to Zurevlev and says something in a voice that the captain will describe in his debriefing report as the voice of a man who has just understood something that frightened him badly. He says, "We need to clear this facility immediately, and we need to call Moscow." Not the divisional commander. Moscow. They clear the facility. They call Moscow. In those steel cylinders, stacked in a temperature-controlled bunker in a pine forest 40 miles from Berlin, was enough of a single chemical compound to kill every living person in London. Twice. And the most extraordinary thing about what Zurevlev found that morning, the thing that makes this story not just a footnote in a chemistry textbook, but one of the most consequential and deliberately buried decisions of the entire Second World War, is that what was in those cylinders was not a new discovery. Germany had been manufacturing this compound since 1942. By the spring of 1945, they had produced approximately 12,000 metric tons of it. The Allies had none. Zero. Not a single kilogram. The weapon in those cylinders could have been deployed over London in 1943, over the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, over the fuel depots and marshalling yards that sustained Patton's drive across France, over the Soviet spearheads racing toward Berlin. It was never used. And the reason it was never used is one of the strangest, most ironic, and most consequential decisions in the history of warfare. A decision made by one man, based on a misunderstanding, so complete that when Allied intelligence officers pieced together the full picture in 1945, several of them reportedly sat in silence for a long time before anyone spoke. The man who made that decision was Adolf Hitler. And what stopped him was a wound he had received in a completely different war, a word he had misread in an intelligence report, and a fear so personal, so irrational, and so total that it overrode every military calculation his generals put in front of him. This is the story of the weapon that could have won the war for Nazi Germany, of the scientist who discovered it by accident while trying to kill insects, of the generals who begged to use it and were refused, of the decision that was never made, and of the reason why, for nearly 30 years after the war ended, almost no one was allowed to know any of this had happened. The secret had a name, Tabun, and history buried it so completely that most people reading this sentence right now have never heard of it. To understand what was in those cylinders at Falkenhagen, we need to go back not to a weapons laboratory, not to a military research facility, not to the SS or the Wehrmacht or any arm of the German war machine. We need to go back to a small industrial research station in Wuppertal, Germany, in December 1936, and to a quiet, methodical chemist named Gerhard Schrader, who was trying to kill aphids. Schrader was 33 years old. He worked for IG Farben, the massive German chemical conglomerate. In 1936, his assignment was mundane. IG Farben wanted a better insecticide. Agricultural chemicals available at the time were expensive, only partially effective, and left residue that contaminated crops. Schrader's job was to find something cheaper and more lethal to insects. He was good at his job, methodical, patient. He worked through hundreds of organophosphate compounds, a class of chemicals that disrupts the way living cells communicate with each other, testing each one for its effectiveness against insects in a controlled laboratory environment. In December 1936, he synthesized compound number 83, which he noted in his laboratory log as being extraordinarily effective against the test insects, more effective than anything he had previously produced. He recorded the synthesis details. He noted the compound's appearance, a faintly bluish, almost colorless liquid with a faint fruity odor. He gave it an internal designation. He called it Preparation September 91. He did not understand yet what he had made. 3 days after synthesis, Schrader and his laboratory assistant began experiencing symptoms that neither of them could immediately explain. Their pupils contracted to pinpoints. They had difficulty breathing. Their eyes streamed. They felt nauseous. They were dizzy. Schrader assumed they had been exposed to some contaminant. He had the laboratory cleaned and ventilated. The symptoms resolved over several days. He went back to work. A few weeks later, testing a fresh batch of Preparation September 91, the symptoms returned. This time Schrader made the connection. The compound itself was affecting them even in minute concentrations, not through skin contact, not through ingestion, but through the air in the room. He was a careful scientist. He documented everything. He also understood, though he did not write it in the log in these terms, that what he had synthesized was not a better insecticide. It was something else entirely. What Schrader had discovered was the first member of what we now call nerve agents, chemical compounds that work by blocking an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which the human nervous system uses to switch off nerve signals after they fire. Without that enzyme, the nerve signals don't stop. Every muscle in the body fires continuously. The heart races and then seizes. The lungs fill with fluid. The diaphragm locks. The nervous system floods itself with its own signals until it burns out. Death, depending on the dose, takes between 1 minute and 10 minutes. There was no antidote that existed in 1936. There is barely an adequate antidote today. Schrader was legally required under German law to report any synthesis with potential military applications to the Wehrmacht. He filed the report. He did not expect anything to happen quickly. What happened next moved very quickly indeed. Within months, a military delegation arrived at Schrader's laboratory. They watched the demonstrations. They reviewed the synthesis logs. They classified everything immediately. They moved Schrader and his research to a military facility under Wehrmacht control. And they gave Preparation September 91 a proper name. They called it Tabun, from the German word taboo, forbidden. The name was both an acknowledgement of what the compound was and a signal that its existence was to be kept entirely secret. By 1938, working under military supervision with greater resources, Schrader had synthesized an even more potent compound, approximately 10 times more lethal than Tabun by weight, effective in even tinier concentrations, nearly impossible to detect before it was already too late. He called it sarin. By 1942, Germany had built a dedicated production facility at a town called Dierenfurth on the Oder River, now in modern Poland, and had begun mass production of Tabun on an industrial scale. By 1945, the stockpile totaled an estimated 12,000 metric tons of Tabun and several hundred tons of sarin. Military planners at the time calculated that a single ton of Tabun, properly aerosolized and delivered over a dense urban population, could cause casualties in the tens of thousands. 12,000 tons. The British had no nerve agents. None. Their chemical warfare research was still working on improved blister agents, mustard gas variants, the weapons of the previous war, because their intelligence services did not know nerve agents existed. The Americans had no nerve agents. Their chemical warfare service had conducted a survey of possible German chemical weapons developments in 1943 and concluded that Germany had not moved significantly beyond its First World War capabilities. The Soviets had no nerve agents. No one outside a small circle of German scientists, military officers, and Nazi leadership knew that these compounds existed. Germany had a weapon with no defense, no antidote, and no Allied countermeasure. A weapon that could be delivered by aircraft, by artillery shell, by rocket. And in the summer of 1944, with the Allied armies breaking out of Normandy, with Soviet forces driving relentlessly from the east, with the Third Reich visibly losing the war on every front, the men who controlled that weapon brought their case to Hitler. They had prepared detailed plans, delivery systems, target lists, projected casualty figures. Hitler listened, and then he said no. To understand why Adolf Hitler refused to use a weapon that his own generals believed could reverse the course of the war, we need to go back not to 1944, but to a night in October 1918, on a ridge in Belgium near the village of Warwick. Hitler was 29 years old, a corporal in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, a decorated soldier who had survived 4 years of the Western Front. On the night of October 13th to 14th, 1918, his unit was caught in a British mustard gas bombardment. Mustard gas is not a nerve agent. It does not kill quickly. It kills slowly and badly, attacking soft tissue, the lungs, the eyes, the skin wherever it makes contact. It blinds. It blisters from the inside. It leaves soldiers incapacitated in agony for days or weeks before they die, or, if they are lucky, recover partial function. Hitler was caught in the gas without adequate warning time. He crawled to the rear. By the time he reached the aid station, he was, in his own later description, going blind. His eyes felt as though they were on fire. He could see only vague shapes and light. He was evacuated to a military hospital in Pasewalk, in northeastern Germany, where he spent the final weeks of the war recovering from what was officially recorded as temporary blindness caused by mustard gas exposure. Whether the blindness was entirely physical or partly psychological has been debated by medical historians for decades. What is not debated is the effect the experience had on Hitler. He described it multiple times in his private conversations and writings. He never described it neutrally. He described it with a visceral, personal horror that was distinct from his other war experiences. The trenches he remembered almost fondly, as a proving ground, a place of camaraderie. The gas he remembered as something else, something that had taken away his sight, something that had left him helpless and blind in a hospital bed while Germany collapsed around him. This wound never healed. In his early political speeches in Mein Kampf, in his private conversations recorded by aides, chemical warfare comes up with a consistency and an emotional intensity that distinguishes it from every other military topic. He does not discuss artillery with this intensity. He does not discuss bombing with this intensity. He discusses gas, and always with the same undertone of personal dread. Now hold that fact in your mind, because in 1944, when his generals brought him the Tabun files, when they showed him the projected casualty figures and the target lists and the delivery systems, something very specific happened inside the Führer's decision-making process. He looked at the weapon, and he saw October 1918. He saw himself blind in a hospital bed. He saw the thing that had already beaten him once, and he said no. The man who carried the Tabun proposal to Hitler most persistently was not a chemist. He was a soldier. General Walther von Axthelm, one of the military officers with full knowledge of the nerve agent program, had been pressing for the deployment of chemical weapons in the summer of 1944. He was not alone. Several senior figures in the Wehrmacht had reviewed the Tabun capability and reached the same conclusion. This was the only asymmetric advantage Germany possessed that the Allies could not immediately counter. The arguments they brought to Hitler were not frivolous. They were detailed, specific, and in retrospect, militarily sound. A single nerve agent attack on the fuel and ammunition supply depots at Cherbourg and Bayeux in August 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, would have paralyzed Patton's Third Army's advance across France. The Third Army was consuming approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel per day at the height of its drive. A successful attack on those supply lines would have stalled the American advance for weeks, potentially months. The Allied armies had no protective equipment specifically designed against nerve agents. Standard-issue gas masks of the period offered partial protection against mustard gas variants, but inadequate protection against Tabun, and essentially no reliable protection against sarin. The Allied Medical Corps had no treatment protocols for nerve agent casualties because Allied medical planners did not know nerve agents existed. The target was vulnerable. The weapon was decisive. The stockpile was available. Hitler refused. He gave different reasons at different times to different people. To some, he said that he believed the Allies possessed similar weapons and would retaliate in kind. To others, he said that chemical warfare would bring condemnation that would turn neutral nations against Germany. To his inner circle, on at least 2 recorded occasions, he said something more personal. He said that he had seen what gas did to men. He said that he could not order it. The generals noted all of this. They filed their memos. They tried again. They were refused again. And here is the detail that makes this story extraordinary. The detail that separates it from a simple story of a dictator's irrational fear. The generals who argued most forcefully for Tabun deployment believed that Hitler's certainty about Allied chemical capability was based on a specific piece of intelligence. They were right. It was. And that piece of intelligence was wrong. Somewhere in the German intelligence archives, there existed by 1943 a report that German intelligence had interpreted as evidence that the Allies had developed and were producing nerve agents of their own. The report was almost certainly a misreading of Allied signals intelligence referring to conventional chemical weapon stockpiles. The Allies had large stocks of mustard gas and phosgene First World War agents, held as a deterrent against German chemical attack. The German intelligence assessment conflated the Allied stockpile references with the German nerve agent program and concluded that the Allies had achieved rough parity in chemical warfare capability. They had not. The Allies had no nerve agents. The intelligence assessment was wrong, but Hitler believed it. And because Hitler believed it, because in his personal calculus the Allies would respond to a nerve agent attack with a nerve agent attack of their own, the deterrence logic that had kept chemical weapons in their storage bunkers through 5 years of war remained locked in place. The irony is almost too neat for history. The weapon that could have changed the war was never used because its possessor believed his enemy had the same weapon. His enemy did not. His enemy did not even know the weapon existed. Churchill's War Cabinet, reviewing chemical warfare preparedness in early 1944, was concerned about German mustard gas capability and had ordered expanded production of Allied mustard gas stocks as a deterrent. The minutes of those meetings contain no reference to nerve agents, no reference to Tabun, no reference to sarin, because the people sitting in that cabinet room had never heard of either compound. The most powerful weapon in the German arsenal was deterred by a phantom, and London and Cherbourg and the beaches of Normandy and the fuel depots of Patton's army, all of them were protected not by countermeasures that existed, but by a misunderstanding in a German intelligence file, and by the memory of a blind young corporal in a hospital bed in Payswalk in October 1918. Before we reach the verdict, I want to introduce you to 2 men who have largely been left out of the history that has been written about this program. Not the generals and not the politicians. The men who actually built it. The first is Gerhard Schrader himself. Schrader was not a Nazi ideologue. His colleagues at IG Farben described him as a man whose primary loyalty was to chemistry, to the problem in front of him, and to the intellectual satisfaction of solving it. He discovered Tabun by accident. He reported it as legally required. He cooperated with the military program because refusal was not a realistic option for a German industrial scientist in 1936. He spent the rest of his career after the war working for Bayer AG, in the same field, organophosphate chemistry, now directed entirely toward legitimate agricultural applications. He held more than 40 patents in pesticide chemistry. He died in 1990, aged 86. His obituaries in German scientific journals described his contributions to agricultural chemistry. They did not mention Tabun. They did not mention sarin. The compounds he synthesized that remained in the public chemical record under his name were the insecticides. The compounds that could have changed the history of the Second World War were listed in documents that were still partially classified when he died. The second man is Dr. Wilhelm Rüdiger, the military chemist, who oversaw the Dyrenfurth production facility from 1942 onward. Rüdiger was responsible for scaling Schrader's laboratory synthesis into an industrial process. The engineering work that turned a small-batch chemical compound into 12,000 metric tons of mass-produced killing agent. He was captured by Soviet forces at Dyrenfurth in January 1945. He was taken to the Soviet Union. He did not return to Germany until 1955, 10 years after the war ended. He never spoke publicly about what he had done at Dyrenfurth or what he had done in the Soviet Union in the decade afterward. He died in obscurity. Schrader, who found the weapon by accident. Rüdiger, who built the factory that made it. Neither man is in the standard histories of the Second World War. They are in the classified files, the chemistry journals, and the debrief reports that took 50 years to be partially released. They deserve to be in this record. When Soviet forces secured the Dyrenfurth production facility in January 1945, they found the plant partially demolished by retreating German forces, but the bulk of the equipment intact. The production records, the synthesis documentation, the remaining stockpiles. The Soviets classified everything immediately and completely. Their chemical warfare scientists understood very quickly what they had found. They dismantled the equipment and shipped east. They transported the remaining Tabun stockpiles to Soviet facilities. They told no one. When American and British forces swept through Western Germany in the spring of 1945 and began the systematic interrogation of German scientists, the nerve agent program emerged in pieces. Gerhard Schrader was found alive at a facility in the British zone. He cooperated with Allied investigators. He provided his synthesis notes. He demonstrated compounds. The British intelligence officers interviewing him were, by multiple accounts, visibly shaken. The debrief reports filed in May and June 1945 by Allied chemical warfare intelligence teams contain language that is notably restrained by the standards of official military documentation, the language of men trained to report facts who are having difficulty processing what the facts mean. One British report, partially declassified in the 1990s, notes simply that the German nerve agent program represented a capability entirely without Allied parallel, and that deployment at any point from 1943 onward would have presented defensive challenges for which no preparation had been made. That is the careful official language for, we had no defense and we didn't know it. What happened next is the burial. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union all moved independently and almost simultaneously to classify the German nerve agent program at the highest level. The reasons overlapped. Each nation wanted the technology for itself. Each nation did not want the others to know how far their own program had progressed. Each nation calculated that public knowledge of Germany's nerve agent stockpile would raise immediate and uncomfortable questions. Why had Germany not used it? And what had the occupying powers done with 12,000 tons of the most lethal substance ever mass-produced? The answer to the second question was, for years, also buried. The United States between 1945 and 1948 loaded approximately 71 tons of captured German nerve agent material onto ships and dumped them into the Baltic Sea and the North Atlantic. The Soviet Union incorporated the Dyrenfurth production technology directly into their own nerve agent program, a program that would eventually produce the compounds collectively known as Novichok, which would surface in international headlines more than 70 years after Zurableff's reconnaissance unit found those cylinders in a pine forest east of Berlin. The British took Schrader's synthesis notes and built their own research program at Portendown. The German nerve agent program was not publicly acknowledged by any government until the 1990s, when a combination of academic research, freedom of information requests, and the collapse of Soviet secrecy finally brought the full picture into view. For nearly 50 years, one of the most consequential near misses in military history was a secret that governments on all sides had agreed, without ever formally agreeing, to keep. So here is the answer to the question at the center of this story. Why did Hitler's secret weapon, a weapon more decisive than the V2, more potentially lethal than any conventional armament either side deployed, never change the war it could have ended? The answer is not simple. It is a knot of several things twisted together. It is a young corporal going blind in a Belgian gas attack in October 1918 and carrying that blindness, the fear of it, the memory of it, the visceral personal horror of it, into a bunker in 1944 where his generals showed him target lists and casualty projections. It is a misread intelligence document that told him his enemies had a weapon they did not have, a phantom deterrent that protected cities that had no other protection. It is the particular nature of a totalitarian system in which no general could override the personal terror of one man, however irrational, however militarily catastrophic, that terror made his decisions. And it is the strange, unglamorous, accidental quality of how the weapon came into existence in the first place, not from a weapons program, not from a military directive, but from a quiet chemist in Wuppertal trying to kill aphids on a December afternoon who synthesized compound number 83 and did not quite understand, for a few days, what was making him sick. The verdict on Germany's nerve agent program is this: it was the most powerful asymmetric advantage either side possessed at any point in the Second World War. It was available. It was deployable. It was stockpiled in quantities that dwarfed anything that would ever be produced by any nation again until the Cold War. It was never used, not because of moral restraint, not because of military incapacity, not because of Allied countermeasures. There were none. It was never used because of one man's nightmare, because of a wound that never healed, because of a blind young corporal in a hospital bed who grew into a dictator who could not separate his personal terror from his military judgment. Captain Zurablev's reconnaissance unit found the cylinders at Falkenhagen in March 1945. He filed his report. He was ordered to maintain strict operational security. He was a Soviet officer. He followed his orders. He survived the war. He returned to his family in what is now Ukraine. He died in 1987. His debriefing report was declassified by Russian archivists in 2003, 58 years after he filed it. His name does not appear in the histories of the war. Gerhard Schrader's name does not appear in the histories of the war. The 12,000 tons of Tabun that sat in their cylinders through the battles of Normandy and the Bulge and the crossing of the Rhine, the weapon that had no defense, that faced no countermeasure, that was never deployed, does not appear in most histories of the war. It was buried, deliberately, systematically, by every government that touched it, not because it was unimportant, because it was too important, too uncomfortable, too revealing of how close the margin had actually been. The history of the Second World War that most people know is a history of what happened. It is a history of beaches stormed and cities liberated and a terrible regime brought down. This is the history of what almost happened, of a weapon sitting in its cylinders while the war was decided without it, of a dictator's nightmare that was, in its strange, unintentional, accidental way, one of the things that allowed the world to survive him. The man who stopped the weapon was the same man who had made it possible. His fear was irrational. His decision was militarily catastrophic for the cause he served. His nightmare was personal and genuine and rooted in real suffering on a Belgian ridge in 1918. And yet, somewhere in that calculation, In the blind young corporal and the gas and the hospital bed in Payswalk is the hinge on which an extraordinary amount of history turned. Not glory, not strategy, not doctrine or logistics or the courage of armies. A nightmare, a misread document, a door that stayed closed. That is the secret that history buried. Now you know it. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it keeps stories like this one visible. The stories that don't fit the standard narrative, that governments classified for 50 years, that belong to men like Zurablev, whose names should not have to be dug out of declassified archives to be remembered. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these doors. Most of them are still only half open. And behind each one is a story that the history you were taught did not have room for. The war was not just what happened on the beaches and in the fields. It was what almost happened in the bunkers and the laboratories and the locked railway sidings. Those stories deserve to be told. This has been one of them.